And so our next question that we posed to our interview, or that we were supposed to pose to our interviewees during this module 3, was, how do we work with regular education teachers in relationship to, getting them to work more closely with the special education department. Now, the administrator, Mrs. Hanson, she really talked about trying to be the person who is always finding the middle ground to what is best practice between the theory that is sometimes brought in from the special education department and then the practicality side of what a classroom teacher says, this is how this is really going to work. This is how this would look if we were to take the theory and put it into practice. And so sometimes, she said that, she has found that there are classroom teachers who, try and skate by doing just the bare minimum because, in their mind, their argument is that they're always trying to, grade papers and lesson plans and do all these things for hundreds of kids versus the few that the special education instructor does. So a lot of times they try and pawn that responsibility off onto the special education instructor. And so, she's just got to be like a mediator. She's got to be the person who says, we're all doing what's best for kids here. Can't we find a way to make this work? And sometimes that's by, creating more time in the day for everybody involved, to make sure that happens. And sometimes it's just to get, both parties in the same room by setting up, meetings, whether those are IEP or 504 meetings, so that we have special education instructors and the regular ed teachers in the same room actually talking to one another instead of just looking at paperwork. Now, Mrs. Hoffman, the special education instructor, she was really more about not necessarily finding time or having to find this middle ground, but just kind of overall setting up this trusting relationship that she spoke of between the special education department and the on-level teachers. Her drive really was that not necessarily that trust exists between the teachers, but more so in the fact that when those students from the special education department come in that classroom, they have trust as well that the special education teacher and the regular ed teacher are on the same page, because there's really nothing more frustrating as far as she was concerned to have a kid come back to her later in the day or the next day even and say, you told me this is what I was going to have to do. You told me I would have this applied to me, or I would have separate setting, or I would get a read aloud, or whatever the case may be. And then to find out that the regular education teacher just did not supply that. And so whenever you create a sense of not being on the same page, kids see that and they lose respect and, trust in those teachers as well. So you've got to have kind of that three-sided triangle, obviously. Each leg is working together to kind of create, a stable, sturdy working environment where, everyone is responsible for the other. And if it seems like we're not working together, then we can't, get kids to be successful. Now, Mrs. Draper, my paraprofessional, she talked more about, she works more closely with the on-level teachers as far as like not necessarily coming up with, but implementing accommodations. So she is the one who is kind of like, at the front line, in this battle with trying to, overcome obstacles when it comes to core teachers trying to teach special education children while also providing them with those accommodations for that, individualized instruction. She is the one that's there that helps make copies for those extra sets of notes, or she's the one that translates notes from the kids' handwriting to legible handwriting if that's what's needed. She's the one that types notes sometimes. She's the one that comes in early or stays late so that she can come by and see every teacher that her kid has and talk about, okay, tomorrow, what is it that we're going to do, so that, first hour the next day when that special education student comes to me and we spend time together, we can prep some of the prior knowledge skills to see what is it the kid already knows, so that when we get to your classroom, I can be already better prepared to service that child. And so that's, kind of how her take on it was that, she just has to work, really work. And that's something that we've seen kind of her share a little bit over the last couple of questions during the interviews as well, was just that she has so much to do and is so overwhelmed, more so than a lot of times the special education instructor and the administrator. I mean, the administrator is overworked. Mrs. Hanson has so much that she has to do within the school day, other things that aren't even special education required. But to just tell someone like a paraprofessional that, you're not going to have any off time throughout this entire day. You have to be with this kid every hour of every day, and you have to supply them with this, with A, B, and C, and if you don't, this is on you, and you have to track paperwork, and you have to do what all these things that they have to do in order to fulfill their goal. And to say that the paraprofessional has that much work to do, but at the same time, when we really look at all three of these, they're the one who is the most involved, but the least paid, to put it pretty bluntly, for the time with the student. It's just something that, I was just really in awe by during these interviews. Sorry, going off on a tangent a little bit. So another question that we asked our interviewees was, what kind of advice did you have for a first year administrator, somebody new coming into the profession? Now, Mrs. Hanson, the principal, she had talked about how, when you come in, you need to kind of take your time, that whether it's in the special education department or if it's, in any field in the building, when it comes to making decisions, a lot of times first year administrators, rush their decision-making process because they feel like everything's an emergency. And if they don't answer right away, it could be that construed by some that they're not doing their job, or that they're not good at their job, or they don't know what they're doing. And she said, that's just not the case. She said, people will respect you more as long as you take the time to go around and get feedback from people, especially in the field of special education when you are not a specialist yourself. So go talk to the special education teachers. If you have coordinators in your building or district, contact them to get as much information as you can, and then make your decision. And I thought, that was that's pretty sound advice. Now, our special education instructor, Mrs. Hoffman, she was kind of the same in that, as much as she talked about, she's looking for an administrator that's going to come in and listen to your concerns, listen to your ideas, your suggestions, but, also your needs and those types of things, so that, everybody, understands that while you're the boss, you're the administrator, you're the one who's ultimately going to make the decisions on what can and can't be done, or what should be done, or, what we're going to stay away from. That when you make those decisions, kind of like earlier when we talked about listening to families and their concerns, everyone seems to be happier. Your staff's going to be happier too, as long as they feel like their voice was heard. Now, Ms. Draper, my paraprofessional, she was about listening just as much, but even more so, she wanted an administrator who was going to take an active role in coming in and asking questions. And those questions are not always necessarily having to be around decisions, but those questions are more about, what can I do as an administrator to help you? How can I find you more time? How can I find you more materials? How can I find you more, fill in the blanks? And that seemed to be kind of what she was looking for. Somebody who was going to come ask her what she needed so that the administrator could work for her. The special education instructor was more about someone who comes, but then someone who listens to what they want to do, what they want to accomplish, and then how do we make that happen? So it was kind of interesting how it's very similar, but at the same time they each have their own take and tweak or goal on what they're really wanting and looking for. So another question that we looked at here was the role of the special education teacher and the principal when we're talking about servicing special education students. And so the administrator, talked about how, from their viewpoint, as a principal, it can be so difficult to find highly qualified special education instructors that are genuinely good with kids. She talked about how even just this last year, she interviewed probably a dozen people for one opening in our special education department out of 20 or 30 people who might have applied. And out of those dozen or so people that she called and or even had to come in for the interviews, she talked about, some of them you could just tell from their own personal stories that these were people that she did not necessarily want in our building around kids, in a one-on-one or, basis. And she even told this story about how someone admitted to her that in one of their past jobs, they had, placed their hands on a student in a way to restrain them when they knew that was necessarily against the rules. But when they were confronted by the principal about the matter later on, they just tried to brush it off as understanding, yeah, it's a slap on the wrist that we're going to get, and we got to fill out some extra paperwork, but what's the big deal? And so, she said that, you'd be surprised at the amount of people that come in with sometimes those attitudes. It's really unfortunate. So her job is to get the best people in the building as possible and then to keep them there. She made a comment during the interview about how special education instructors, a lot of times, she said on average for the state of Kansas, and maybe she meant nationally, but I think she was talking about Kansas anyway from her data viewpoint, that they burn out after 5 years. And that's, right on up there with, general ed teachers as well. We talk about first year teachers lasting 3 to 5 years before they leave the profession. And so, how do we keep the best special education teachers possible in the building? How do we get them there, and then how do we keep them? Now, my special education instructor, Mrs. Hoffman, she really talked about, supporting special education in general. I think here I think she was talking more about, the principal. She wants someone who's going to come in and really push to have, more inclusion in the building, or to have special programs brought in that don't currently exist, whether those are, life skills or mediation or, just, a multitude of things. And so that was kind of more her idea, is to have positive interactions with, kids. And so whether that's the principal or a special education teacher or any staff member in the building, really, is to find a way to get those kids to interact with you, especially kids with severe conditions. So now my paraprofessional, she talked about how the principal is somebody who, they're in charge of the building. They have to, make all these decisions, and they're overseeing programs and curriculum and those types of things, discipline. But that's kind of their job. There's somebody who's supposed to be, kind of a gatekeeper as far as finances and other things go. But really, it seemed like Miss Draper really had a much stronger idea or concept in her, that she shared as far as the special education teacher being the one who, is the expert in the field of that student. They know way more about that student than the principal does. They're the one who has dove into, the test scores and the medical records and those types of things that come with every kid that they see on their caseload, and that's the person really with the specialty and the expertise to make the best decisions, and that the building principal is somebody who really is there to just back up the special education teacher's findings, especially if you have a good special education teacher. So whenever we're going to hire, a new administrator in the building, how are they best going to fit into the special education department? What kind of characteristics are we going to look for here? Now, Mrs. Hanson, when she was hired into our building, she actually hired an assistant principal, and she said it's very similar in the same regards. They get asked the same types of questions in the interview process. And so when it comes to the special education department, she talked about how knowledge isn't everything. And she posed a really good point. Very rarely are you ever going to see an administrator that taught every subject. They're not going to have been a science teacher and an English teacher and a math teacher and, a shop teacher and a gym teacher and all that. It's not going to happen. So how can we expect a principal necessarily to always be an expert at everything let alone special education. Now, if you have someone who comes from the special education department, that's great, but that still means they're not an expert in other areas